So food banks are bracing for the worst winter we've ever seen. We're expecting to have to provide 1 million food parcels between December and February, so that's one every 8 seconds. And we have never seen this level of need in our communities across the UK. We see an incredible range of people coming to food banks. The main groups that we see kind of overrepresented, so families with children make up an enormous proportion. And actually last year, for the first time ever, we provided 1 million food parcels for children. This year, I think it's going to be even more. Disabled people as well, so the majority of people coming to our food banks are either disabled themselves or live with someone who is.
This morning there was news that the Conservative candidate for Tamworth had created a flowchart. I don't know if you've seen this, but he created a flowchart about food banks and about whether people should have access to them. In that flowchart, he said, if you have a £30 phone contract, you shouldn't be allowed to use a food bank. If you've got your nails done, you shouldn't be allowed to use it. And the end of that was basically telling people to F off. I mean, how does it feel when you hear that kind of rhetoric being used about food banks?
I mean, I think, to be honest, that way of talking doesn't represent the majority of people in any of our political parties. It certainly doesn't represent the British public. So we know from the polling we've done, the majority of the British public are deeply concerned with the level of hardship they are seeing in their own communities. They don't believe people should ever have to turn to food banks, and they do believe the government should step in and do more to support people so that they can buy the essentials of life with dignity.
What sort of support could you expect or would you want from the government?
I think the most important thing we want from the government is for them to create in legislation a guarantee that universal credit will always cover at least the cost of essentials. And that seems like common sense, doesn't it? In the short term, we've got the autumn statement coming up. We would like to see actually really urgently the government confirm benefits will go up at least with the inflation statistics that were out today. And also going further to give people more help across this period. So things like most people who come to our food banks on universal credit aren't even getting the whole amount because they're having money knocked off to pay back debts to the government. So the government could very quickly just reduce the amount of money they're knocking off for debt deductions, and that would make a really big difference to a lot of families.
What do you mean by that? What sort of debts might they owe the government?
Well, the biggest thing that people tend to owe is actually, so because when you apply for universal credit, you have to wait for 5 weeks at least before your first payment comes in. Most people in low incomes don't have the kind of savings to tide them over, so they're offered what the DWP calls an advance. And it's basically a loan, so you get some money to tide you over for the next few weeks, but then that has to be paid back from your universal credit payments. So the level that is already far below what you need to cover essentials is then taken even lower to pay back those debts. There's also a problem with, so you might remember the old tax credit system. People got overpayments years and years ago for mistakes. When they moved to universal credit, they suddenly find themselves paying back these debts, which they didn't even know they had and were often government mistakes. So that again is taken off your benefits. And then there's things like council tax debt, if people can't afford to pay the council tax, or utility debt. So all of this is landing on people at the same time as food prices are soaring and their incomes are already inadequate to cover just the basics of life.
Well, there was a report by Christians Against Poverty, and they were calling for universal credit to be raised from £85 a week to £120 a week. Would that be the right sort of ballpark?
So the government should absolutely raise universal credit from the current £85 a week to £120 a week. So we, with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, did some research to look at, well, what is the amount somebody needs if you're a single person to cover just your essential costs, and it's £120 a week. So at the moment, people are £35 short every single week if they're getting the full amount of universal credit. And if, say, you're disabled, you might well have additional costs. You won't necessarily get additional benefits. So that, again, is pulling people below just the level you need to get by.
When we're looking ahead to winter, is there a concern from your group and possibly the Joseph Rowntree Foundation as well that people might not put on their heating because they simply can't afford to?
Well, we're absolutely concerned that as winter sets in, people should be putting on their heating. It is not healthy to be living in a cold house. It is not healthy to be living in a house with damp, with mould. But so many people can't afford to turn the heating on. And what we will see is that will exacerbate the health difficulties people have. That will increase strain on the NHS. We already had last month, health leaders wrote to the Prime Minister to say the number of people going without essentials poses a grave risk to the nation's health, and they were calling on the Prime Minister to go with the guarantee that universal credit will cover essentials. So we know that this is going to increase pressure on the NHS. It also holds people back from things like getting into work. If you're living in an unhealthy house, you're skipping meals, you're lying awake all night because you're anxious about bills, that makes your mental and physical health worse, makes it harder to get a job, to keep a job. So we're undermining all the other things the government wants to do by not tackling this fundamental problem of destitution.
So in a line that a Conservative might understand, it harms productivity.
So the level of hardship we're seeing definitely harms productivity, it harms our economy, it increases pressure on public services. And these are all things we know the government's rightly worried about, but we need to tackle this if we want to meet those challenges.
I mean, a couple of years ago, I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg who said that food banks were part of the community, something that they quite liked having in the community. What did you make of that?
I think from our point of view, what we have is an army of volunteers out there in our communities wanting to help one another and contribute to our communities. That is fantastic. What's happening at the moment is those people are having to spend enormous amounts of time getting stock in, packing up parcels, handing out emergency food. Imagine what they could be doing if they didn't have to do that. If we actually had a social security safety net that meant nobody has to turn to a food bank just for the essentials, all those people would be doing the things many of them already do alongside that. So tackling social isolation, helping people get into work, helping people with debt advice, all those other things. But at the moment, that gets squeezed because we're having to meet this rising need for emergency food. And food banks were never supposed to be a long-term solution to this. They were never intended to be the solution to ongoing poverty. But that is what has been happening in the last few years.
You keep saying people getting into work. You keep talking about people who are working, who have to use food banks. Do you think that the public would be surprised that it's working people who are having to fall back on food banks?
I think it's one of the things people are often very surprised about. When you look at who is in poverty these days, the majority are in working households. And when we look at the people referred to our food banks, about a fifth are in working households. And what we find is that when people are in work, it tends to be not just low paid, but insecure. So you don't have a reliable wage coming in every month. And that means it's not protecting people in the way that it should. The other thing we often see is, particularly for disabled people, parents and carers, many would like to be in work, but they can't find a job that is accessible, that is flexible. They can't find the support that would let them get into work and sustain a job. And that leaves them very vulnerable to the kind of hardship that we're now seeing.
Do you get many people who work in, say, the NHS who have to use food banks?
We get people from a really wide range of sectors using food banks. So you see people who are in caring professions, who are in the NHS, you see people who are working in hotels, in restaurants. In all of these sectors, people find themselves not able to cover the bills, to buy food, to buy essentials, because their work is not paying them enough and is not steady enough, and the social security payments that top up low wages are not adequate. So last month, more than half of people on universal credit ran out of food and couldn't afford to buy more. And that was the case for people who were in work on universal credit as well as those who are out of work.
Just finally, I'm picking up on your word emergency. I mean, emergency food parcels. How do you feel using that word or that phrase in the UK?
It's outstanding. It's incredible, isn't it, that in a country as wealthy as ours, 1 in 7 people have faced hunger because they couldn't afford enough food and other essentials. And the idea that last year we provided nearly 3 million emergency food parcels. And I think we know that this is not the society any of us want to live in, and it's not what you should be seeing in a country like the UK.